Hello, and welcome to this session over Fortnite's real-time lighting tools and techniques. My name is Zach Parrish with Epic Games. And if you will all allow me, I'm going to try this once, and I hope I get it right. 안녕하세요. Awesome. Ha! Cool. That is all of the Korean I know. So, in this session, we are going to talk about the challenges of lighting in Fortnite and some of the features that we added to Unreal Engine to overcome those challenges. We'll talk about mesh distance fields, ray trace distance field shadows. We'll take a look at ambient occlusion. We'll talk about capsule shadows for characters. We'll cover dynamic light culling and dynamic shadow caching. And then we'll take a few moments and I'll show you volumetric fog. And just for fun, I'll show you the setup for Fortnite's time of day system. So let's begin with the challenge of lighting in Fortnite. Fortnite is a bright and colorful world, and lights play a big part in the overall look. Throughout gameplay, there are dramatic changes in level lighting. There is a full day-night cycle. And there's a storm that comes in and it changes all of the game's lighting. Most things in the game are destructible. So that means that there was no way for us to pre-bake or pre-calculate lighting. Traditionally at Epic, all of our games rely on pre-calculated lighting for high quality. And we couldn't do that with Fortnite. However, we wanted realistic lighting features. We wanted reliable character shadows. We wanted ambient occlusion. We wanted volumetric lighting. And above all, it had to run well on console. So the first feature we added to the engine to make this possible was mesh distance fields. So what is a mesh distance field? Essentially, a mesh distance field is just a 3D volumetric texture. It's like a field that surrounds a mesh and stores distances from the mesh's surface. Positive values are stored outside the mesh, and negative values are stored inside. Now, we use these values for lighting calculations because it's far cheaper than ray tracing against the actual mesh. Now, we pre-calculate these mesh distance fields in the editor. We do not produce them at runtime. Their runtime cost is just texture memory. Each mesh distance field has a maximum size of 8 megabytes, which works out to 128 pixels in X, Y, and Z. So how do we use mesh distance fields? The first requirement is that we turn them on, and this is just a project setting. So let me jump over to the editor and I'll show you where that is. I need to go to my project settings. So I will click on Edit and go down to Project Settings. And just to make it easy, I will just search for mesh distance fields. And I don't even have to type out the whole thing. And we have 3 checkboxes here. We have generate mesh distance fields, 8-bit mesh distance fields, and compress mesh distance fields. The last two I'll talk about a little bit later. To activate mesh distance fields for your project, you just need to turn this on. Doing this does require that you restart the editor, so I'm not going to do it here, and it's already on in any case. Now, after you do that, the editor will process all of the mesh distance fields for all of the loaded meshes in the editor. This can take a little bit of time depending on the density of your content as well as the hardware you're running on. So once you have this turned on, it's nice to be able to visualize the mesh distance fields in your map. So here I have a small snippet of Fortnite, a little portion of it. And I'm going to go under Show, Visualize, and choose Mesh Distance Fields. So now you can see what these mesh distance fields look like for the different types of meshes in the scene. Now it's important to note that mesh distance fields are approximate representations of meshes in the map. They're not perfect. That's going to become important when we start to generate lighting calculations from them. And you'll see that in a few moments. Also, I would like to point out that I have set Visualize Mesh Distance Fields on a hotkey just so I can turn it on and off really quickly. So if you see me doing that really suddenly, I'm just hitting my hotkey. Okay, so let's talk about the first feature using mesh distance fields, and that is ray-traced soft shadowing. And to show this off, I'm going to go to church. So here in the back of this church, there's a little pipe organ. And this is already set up to use mesh distance field soft shadowing. So watch as I move this light back and forth. You can see that the shadows are not razor sharp like they usually are with dynamic lighting. So how do you set this up? If I slide the camera back a little bit, there's a little chair back here with a single spotlight over it. And let's talk about how we turn on ray trace shadows. Step one is to turn them on your light. So I'll just select my spotlight, and I'll search for ray, and you'll see the option for it. So here's ray trace distance field shadows. And I'll turn that on, and we are now using ray-traced distance field shadows, but they're not very good quality. So why is that? If I switch back over to mesh distance field visualization, it becomes clear why. The distance field has a nice representation of the seat of the chair, but not the back. So let's talk a little bit about how we can edit this and how we can control it. If I select the chair, I can open up the static mesh editor for it. I'll just carefully put this on the right side of the screen. Okay, so here in the static mesh editor, there is some important information about how much memory distance fields take up. You'll see it listed here. And this is saying that currently our mesh distance field is 8 by 8 by 19 pixels and currently takes up 0 megs. I'm sure there's a number down there somewhere, but it would be like 0.000 megs of memory. And obviously, our mesh distance field doesn't look very good, so let's talk about how we can improve that. There's a property under your LOD settings called Distance Field Resolution Scale. So I'll set that to something very high, like 5. And as soon as it recalculates my mesh distance fields, now you can see the distance field is much more detailed. So now the ray trace shadow is also far more detailed, but there's a problem. If we take a look, we're now using 0.21 megabytes of memory just for this single mesh. So you have to be very careful how you adjust your distance field resolution scale, because you can use up the memory in your computer very quickly. So I'll set this back down to something low, like maybe 1.2. And we're starting to get some nice shadowing. Maybe I would set it to something like 1.5. Here we go. So we're starting to see a nice shadow. We're now using 0.01 megabytes of memory, so there's a trade-off. And it's really up to the artist to control how much quality they want in the shadow versus how much memory they want to use to make that possible. It's also important to note that you have the option of replacing the distance field mesh. This means you could use an entirely separate 3D model for your distance field. This is very useful if your LOD is for like a single billboard card, but you still want it to cast proper volumetric shadows. Okay, so let's talk about other ways that we use mesh distance field shadows. Distance field shadows are 30 to 50% cheaper than traditional cascaded shadow maps. However, animations don't show up. This means that if you have a mesh such as a tree and the branches are blowing, the shadows will not pick up that motion because the mesh distance field is completely static. So what we do is, beyond 4,500 units from the camera, we switch to mesh distance field shadows. The idea is that at 45 meters, the player can no longer really see the shadows not moving around anymore anyway. We also smoothly blend that cutoff so it isn't so obvious. Alternatively, you could hide it altogether with post-process effects such as depth of field. Now, switching out to distance field shadows and only using cascaded shadow maps close to the camera saves us several milliseconds on GPU and is a very important optimization for Fortnite. Next, let's discuss distance field ambient occlusion. Traditionally, in most of our games, ambient occlusion is completely pre-calculated using light mass, or is handled entirely in screen space. If you're unfamiliar, ambient occlusion is how objects tend to shadow each other from ambient light. It explains why shadows tend to coalesce in the corners of a room and around the edges of details. So we can use the distance fields around our meshes to simplify the calculations for ambient occlusion and calculate it in runtime. This requires a movable skylight in your scene. So to show this off, I'm going to come over here to this fire hall. Now, we can visualize distance field ambient occlusion by going under Show, Visualize, and Distance Field Ambient Occlusion. And again, I have this on a hotkey, so I'll be turning it on and off a little bit. So this is just showing the result of your distance field ambient occlusion and nothing else. Typically, if I wanted to edit my ambient occlusion, I would do that in my Moveable Skylight. So I would just add a Moveable Skylight to my scene, and I could control the settings from there. In Fortnight, however, we use the world settings to hold all of a level's light. So I can change my settings in here. So there are 3 properties that you need to know about to properly use distance field ambient occlusion. The first is Occlusion Max Distance. This controls the maximum distance 2 objects can be away from each other and still occlude one another. You must be very careful how you edit this because it makes ambient occlusion cost a lot more the higher it goes. So by default here in Fortnight, it is set to 600 units, and I'll set it to 1,000. And you can see the ambient occlusion gets a little darker. This is because we're now reaching out further and finding more objects that are occluding. However, this is not your only option to darken your ambient occlusion. So I'll set that back to its default value, and we'll stop visualizing distance field ambient occlusion. So we can take the final result of ambient occlusion and adjust its contrast. So I can take the occlusion contrast property and set this to 1 instead of 0, and you'll see the ambient occlusion get a bit darker. I can also control the exponent, or the fall off, for the ambient occlusion. So let's set that up to 1.2, not 102. So the artist has a lot of control over the final result for ambient occlusion. And these settings will hold true across the map for any mesh that is using distance field ambient occlusion. So if I move into this apartment building, you'll see that it's very dark. And if I set my settings back to their defaults, everything brightens back up. Now, we do not use each individual mesh distance field in a level to create distance field ambient occlusion. Doing that would be prohibitively expensive. Instead, we calculate a global distance field comprised of all of the static geometry in the scene. This simplified composite makes it much faster to produce the calculations for distance field ambient occlusion. We can visualize this as well if we go under Show, Visualize, Global Distance Field. So you can see this is even simpler than the distance fields we saw before. You should know that because this is calculated on the fly as your camera moves through the scene, if you teleport the player to a new area, you may notice a slight hitch as the global distance field has to be fully recalculated. Now let's cover some caveats and considerations when using mesh distance fields. First, mesh distance fields are for DirectX 11 and up only. Next, as we've already kind of discussed, they ignore deformation, so no animated vertices. This also means that they do not work for skeletal meshes. Also, they only support uniform scaling. Now, you actually have a little bit of wiggle room here. If you want to scale up a little bit in one axis, that's okay. Just don't go too far, because what happens is the mesh distance field extends even further, and that can cause artifacts in distance field ambient occlusion. Next, mesh distance fields work best on smaller to medium-sized parts. You would not use a single mesh to comprise something like this entire building, because the mesh distance field would be very large and its resolution would be too low to yield a nice result. For example, if we go back over to our scene, you'll notice that my fire hall is actually made up of several individual meshes. This means that the mesh distance fields have a lot of detail. And finally, adjust your mesh distance field resolution scale with great care, because as we've seen, that can really crank up the amount of memory that you're using. Remember, all things in moderation. Okay, so you can use a console command to visualize how much memory your mesh distance fields are using. So let's take a quick look at that. I'm going to bring up the output log, and let's clear it because there's a lot of junk in it. Now, I'll bring up the console with the tilde key, and we'll type r.aol. If you can remember r.aol, then you can see the command. It's AO list mesh distance fields. So I'll click on that and press enter, and after a moment of calculation, the output log now contains a list of all of the mesh distance fields currently loaded in my scene. It's sorted by how much memory they're using. It also tells you what the mesh distance field resolution scale is, and it gives you the name of the object and its path. This is a very nice way to track down which mesh distance fields are consuming the most memory in case you have to go clean that up. And then go yell at an artist for setting the scale too high. The next setting I'd like to cover is compressing mesh distance fields. This is the project setting that we saw just a little bit earlier, so I'll show you once again where those are. It's under Edit, Project Settings, and again, we'll just search for mesh distance fields. And here is compress mesh distance fields, and here's 8-bit mesh distance fields. So compressing mesh distance fields uses less texture memory because since it's just textures, it's very easy to compress those. However, there is a drawback to it. If you're using level streaming in your levels, you may notice a slight hitch as the textures are decompressed. You can also choose to use 8-bit mesh distance fields. By default, these are stored in 16-bit map values. So 8-bit uses half the memory, but it can cause artifacting. So you're making a trade-off of quality versus how much memory you want to use. However, it's worth pointing out that the distance fields in this project are already using 8-bit, and they actually look pretty good. But they look good for Fortnite's content, and Fortnite is very stylized and has a very chunky style. So up to this point, we have only talked about shadowing for static objects, for objects that aren't dynamic and moving around your scene. So what about characters? For characters, we use Capsule Shadows. This is because per object dynamic shadows get very expensive very quickly. A capsule shadow is built from a representation of the character made out of physics capsules. It's simpler, it's faster to calculate, and it provides a few free features like soft shadowing for characters. This is activated for each individual skeletal mesh, so let's take a look at how to use it. Right here next to the fire station, there's this little husk character. And if you've only ever played Battle Royale, you've never seen one of these before. So we'll pull this guy out into the sun so we can see his shadow. And right now the shadow is very detailed. You can see his fingers, you can see the helmet hanging off of his hip. It looks very nice, but it's also the most expensive kind of shadow we could apply to him. So with him selected, I will search for Capsule, and there is Capsule Direct Shadow. If I turn this on, he gets a much more simplified shadow that is automatically a little bit softer, which for most outdoor scenes actually looks a little bit better. Like if you have any sort of humidity or clouds passing in front of the sun, this will tend to look a lot more realistic than razor-sharp shadows. And here is where we set up our capsule shadows. If I open up the skeletal mesh editor and scroll down under the asset details, first you'll see the physics asset for the character. This is how we create ragdolls for every character in our game. Now, down beneath that, we have a second physics asset called the shadow physics asset. And this looks very similar, but it's made entirely out of capsules. No other type of geometry is allowed. And that's because capsules are regular mathematical shapes. You know what they look like. It's very easy to code a capsule and to run tests off of that shape. And that's how we perform our shadow calculations. There are, however, a few caveats to capsule shadows. The first one is fairly obvious, that they lose some detail. This is because you are generally making a simplified version of the character. The other is that capsule shadows can sometimes bleed through walls and through floors. And if we take a look at the character's feet, you can kind of start to see why. So those capsules for his feet are scaled up pretty big. So if he was walking around and his feet were flush with the floor, that capsule may stick down through the geometry. You may notice this in your games. If you look up and see a character walking on the floor above you, you may notice their shadow coming down through the floor. All right, the next feature is distance culling for dynamic lights. Lots of dynamic lights get very expensive very quickly. And users generally don't notice distant lights as much. So we have a simple setting in the engine to automatically cull lights at distance so that as the camera moves away from them, we can fade them away and then remove them entirely. This was a huge performance boost for Paragon, and you should always use this on all of your dynamic lights. Never skip this setting. So let's show how it works. I'll go back over here to the church. And over here in this little alcove, let's add a few test lights. So I'll just drag in a point light, and I'll assign it a completely random color. And let's bring in another light with a totally different color. Okay, right now, if I move away from these lights, they are always on. So even if I was way back here and not really looking at them, they would still be on, they would still be calculated, and they would still be eating up cycles on my GPU. So what we can do is select these lights, and down toward the bottom of their properties list, there is a section labeled Performance, and you'll see the property Max Draw Distance. So let's set these for both of our lights. For the pink light, we'll set this to 1000, and for the blue light, let's set it to 700. So now, as I move away from the lights, they are removed from calculation. They're culled. The problem with this is that they're culled very suddenly, and that would be distracting to the player. So we can use max distance fade range to control that. So for the pink light, let's set this to 500, and for the blue light, let's set it to something really close, like 300. So now, as I move away, the blue light is already fading away, and the pink light is close behind. This is very easy to set. It will save you a lot of performance, but be careful because it's also very easy to overlook. Artists forget to set this all the time, so make sure that you're staying on top of that. The next feature is dynamic shadow caching. And this is kind of difficult to show off in the engine because all of the calculation for it is taking place behind the scenes. So I'm going to talk with my hands a little bit to try to explain it. If you have a street light in a scene, and you have a mailbox, and the street light is not moving, and the mailbox is not moving, then why would you cast a dynamic shadow on every single frame? It gets expensive. So what we do instead is if these objects are not moving, we only calculate a dynamic shadow one time. And then, as long as neither of these objects move, we just use the cached version of that shadow. We don't recalculate, we just grab the data that was already recorded. We will continue to do that until something changes, like maybe somebody comes over and bangs on the mailbox with a pickaxe and it goes away. Then we recalculate all the shadows until everything stops moving, and then we stop again, and we only use the cached data. Now, the good news is you don't have to do any work to use this feature. It's on by default. You get it for free. It does have a couple of rules. Your primitives need to be set to static or stationary, and your lights need to be set to movable. Your initial shadow, just as a reminder, that first shadow that is cast does come at full cost. So one frame will be very expensive. It's only the frames after that that are made cheaper so long as nothing moves. So in a simple test scene with 3 shadow casting lights, without caching, that scene was taking 14.89 milliseconds. With caching, it dropped down to less than 1 millisecond. It was down to 0.9. So, moving on, let's talk about fog. Fog is one of the primary features of the environment in Fortnite, and it really affects how lighting plays out in the level. Recently, we added volumetric fog to the exponential height fog actor in Unreal. So it's just a checkbox on an exponential height fog actor. Just turn on volumetric fog. In this map, I don't really need to do that. We already have everything set up. And to show this off, I'm going to go into my world settings. Now, on your scenes, your fog will not be set up in world settings. This is something we did in Fortnite. The reason for this is that we knew that every single level in Fortnite needed to have the same lighting setup. So rather than force our artists to keep rebuilding the same light setup over and over again on every level, our engineers simply set up the lights inside the world settings component. So let's take a look at this. Actually, I'll show you something kind of cool. Let's take a look at the time of day manager. So this is a way that artists can control the time of day, so they can adjust content and lighting. So I can quickly set this to morning, or day, or evening, or night. Or if I want smooth control over what time of day it is, I actually have a slider I can use to control that. And if we look up at the sky, you can see the sun and the moon moving around overhead. So all of this control was set up in C++. And these controls are actually, in turn, controlled by game code. So I'm going to set it to nighttime. And let's take a look at our fog settings. The first setting is fog density. This is a global setting on a volumetric height fog actor. So I'll just search for density. And we'll go down under night. And as I increase this value, you'll see my fog gets a lot more dense. We'll leave it pretty high for now. The next property is scattering distribution, and this controls how directional the fog is. So let me search for it, and I'll show you how it works. So as I increase this toward 1, the fog becomes significantly more directional. What that means is you'll see it more obviously as you look toward the light. If I move really fast, you can see that the illumination is almost like a beam that is constantly trying to aim at the camera. Let's pull that back down to its default value. The next property is albedo. This is how reflective the fog is. The fog is generally made of water and typically has an albedo of or very near 1, but as I pull this down, you see we essentially remove the effect of the fog. The extinction scale controls the fall off of the fog. So as I adjust this, we can make the fog very, very thick. Essentially what this is doing is removing light. It causes the fog to remove light, the effect of lights within it. So the higher it gets, the harder it is to see lights inside the fog. And then finally we have view distance, and all this controls is how far the volumetric fog calculation goes. Which is buried way down here. There we go. Now, even as I adjust this to be very low, you still see some fog. So the difference is the fog that falls outside the range is just traditional exponential height fog. It's not volumetric and will not respond to volumetric lighting. So let's talk a little bit about volumetric lights. If I actually, let's do something kind of fun. I'm going to go to the top of the clock tower, And let's bring in a point light. And let's see, let's make it green. We haven't used green yet. Now, if we want our light to respond to volumetric fog, it actually is a little bit. You can see there's a green halo coming off of the clock tower now, but the light is not casting shadows in the fog. So if you want that, you need to check Cast Volumetric Shadow. So if I turn that on and I crank up my intensity, let's make it really high. Let's go with something like 3000. You can start to see shadows being cast inside the fog. Now, you can also scale how much that scattering intensity is. So if I didn't want my light to be that bright, we could set it back down to something like 150. And I can take my volumetric scattering intensity, and I can use that just to boost how much of an effect this light has over fog. So let's review. We talked about the challenges of lighting a game like Fortnite and how it forced us into using a strictly dynamic lighting setup, and how we overcame those challenges by adding new features to the engine. We added mesh distance field support. Using these, we were able to add ray trace distance field shadows, ambient occlusion. We talked about capsule shadows on characters. We took a look at dynamic light culling. We talked about dynamic shadow caching, and we talked about volumetric fog. If you would like any further information about anything discussed here, everything I've talked about is already covered in our documentation. So now's a good time to get your camera out and take a picture of that slide. So are there any questions over anything I've discussed so far?
순간적으로 빛이 꺼지는 효과인 맥스 드로우 디스턴스에 대해서 설명해 주셨는데요. 그거 말고 점차적으로 천천히 빛이 꺼지는 효과에 대해서 다시 한 번만 설명해 주실 수 있나요?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Thank you.
So let's, first off, let me get out of this foggy setting. Okay, so I'll go back into the church, and here we can see our two lights. It's controlled by two values. You'll find both of these under the performance group of your light. So for now, let's just keep it simple, and I'll just use the pink light. And if I scroll down, you'll see the performance group, and it only has two properties: max draw distance and distance fade range. Think of it like this. If you are closer to the light than the max distance fade range, then the light is at full brightness. As you move beyond the max distance fade range, the light begins to fade, until you hit the max draw distance, and then the light is completely off and it's culled away. Does that make sense?
네, 그리고 그 캐싱에 대해서 다시 한 번만 알려주실 수 있나요?
Sure. So caching is very hard for me to demonstrate in the engine because it's all happening behind the scenes. The way it works is as long as a dynamic light is casting a shadow onto an object that is not moving, if neither the light or that object are moving, then we cache the first shadow so that we don't have to cast a brand new shadow on every single frame. Think of it this way. As long as nothing changes, you don't need to record a whole new shadow. You can use the one that you've already recorded. Only after something changes do you have to record a whole new shadow and start over again. Does that make sense?
네.
Cool. Next question. I lost my translator.
그 방금 그 안개 그 모드가 있는데 그 안개를 그 효과를 활용해서 그 뭐냐 그 본 게임에 뭐 혹시 적용을 해서 그렇게 그 안개 모드라는 그게 적용이 할 계획이 있는지 좀 질문드립니다.
So fog is already being used extensively in Fortnite, but primarily in Save the World, not in Fortnite Battle Royale. And mostly that's just for game design reasons. It's a very long-range game. We want to make it easy for you to use things like a sniper rifle. But maybe one day.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Over here? Come get the microphone. Ah, look, cooperation. This is nice.
그 안개를 볼륨메트릭 포그를 사용해서 일정 거리 내에는 모든 게 되게 선명하게 보이는데 그 범위를 넘어가면 아예 하나도 안 보이게 약간 안개 벽처럼 만드는 것도 가능한가요?
You mean like completely cull it entirely out of the game?
네, 약간
Really, you could do that with your fog density. We don't actually remove it from the game anymore. That is an older fog method from video games of like the late 90s. But you could, if you already knew the maximum distance of the fog, you could set the max draw distance for every object in your game so that if it's farther than the value of the fog, that object would just stop rendering.
감사합니다.
Next question? Oh, we have a helper now.
포트나이트 배틀로얄에서 그 메쉬 디스턴스 필드 사이즈가 만약에 전체 맵의 사이즈가 어느 정도 되는지 궁금하고요. 그리고 이게 콘솔이나 모바일 같은 플랫폼에서도 이제 어떻게 적용이 되고 있는지, 메모리 사이즈나 뭐 프레임당 먹는 처리 시간 이런 것들이 조금 궁금합니다.
That's a lot of questions. It's going to vary. We try to have only one setting that works across the board. I don't actually know what each individual setting is, but I do know that to maintain performance specifically for Battle Royale, we did have to keep that very low. More than that, it's kind of difficult to say.
감사합니다.
Next question. Oh, there's one.
포트나이트 안에서 지금 사용하고 있는 실시간 라이팅이 그러니까 한번 보여지는 거 안에서 사용되는 다이나믹 라이팅의 개수가 지금 권장되는 게 지금 몇 개 정도 되는지 그게 지금 궁금합니다.
So the number of dynamic lights you can have in a scene is really dependent on your content. If you are being very responsible over keeping light radius very low and only casting shadows on lights that absolutely need it, you can have over 100 dynamic lights in a scene very easily. But it is very dependent on the type of content you're creating. As always, you should be testing your content and profiling at all times to see if you've pushed things too far.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I see two. Okay, this one, sure. Let's do this one first.
질문 두 개만 하겠습니다. 첫 번째는 그 VR에서 VR 관련인데요. VR에서 이제 그 스테이셔너리라든가 무버블로 라이팅을 했을 때 코스트가 상당히 비싸던데 그거를 이제 조금 더 옵티마이징 할 수 있는 뭐 트릭이라든가 팁이 있으면 좀 알려주셨으면 하고요. 그다음에 두 번째는 볼륨메트릭 포그 같은 경우도 상당히 좀 비싸더라고요. VR에서 혹시 현실적으로 사용할 수 있을까? 혹시 사용할 수 있다면 어떤 방법이 가장 좋을까? 아니면 뭐 그것도 페이크라고 해야 되나? 뭐 다른 방법으로 흉내낼 수 있는 방법이 있다면 혹시 알려주시면 감사할 것 같습니다.
Okay, so your first question was about dynamic lights in VR and if we had any tricks to make them more efficient.
Yes.
Use less of them. Honestly, that's the only trick, especially in VR. You're doing so much more work, and if you're targeting, especially something like, if you're targeting something like VR on console, like PSVR, then you have even less headroom. So the trick is really to do less and fake things. To that end, fog is kind of the same story. Volumetric fog has a base cost of about 3 milliseconds in Fortnight, but I can see where in VR that might be a lot more expensive. I don't think we would recommend using that feature in VR. If you had to fake it, you could probably try just using regular exponential height fog without using the volumetric side of it. If you needed volumetrics, you could do it the old-fashioned way, like we did in the 90s with geometry that had a translucent emissive shader on it. In fact, we still do that with a lot of our projects.
질문 한 개만 더 하겠습니다. 혹시 그럼 VR에서 앰비언트 오클루전을 포워드 렌더링 쓰다 보면은 앰비언트 오클루전도 사용할 수가 없는데 혹시 그것도 그러면 그냥 안 쓰는 형태로 가야 되는 건가요? 아니면은 뭐 다르게 쓸 수 있는 흉내 낼 수 있는 방법이 있나요, 그것도?
Yeah, of course, you can always bake that into an object. That's going to be tricky if you have a very dynamic scene where light is always changing. But you always have to consider those types of trade-offs in VR. There's no easy way out. Any other questions?
네, 저 세팅을 월트 세팅 값에서 다 직접 만드셨다고 했는데 그 세팅 값이 아니면 그러니까 보통은 어디서 조정을 하고 그 날짜마다 날 시간마다 조정을 어떻게 해야 되는 건가요?
Well, a full day-night setup for a game is actually a concert of several different objects all working together. By default in the engine, there is no one time of day setting. What I demonstrated is actually a system that we specifically built for Fortnite. And it's controlling many things all at once. It's controlling a dynamic light. It's controlling a skylight. It's controlling atmospherics. It's controlling exponential height fog. And it's doing all of this based on a definition of a C++ code class. So if you really wanted that, you would have to build something similar yourself. Maybe one day we'll put a sample together that we could give out to show how this is done. Any other questions? Okay, thank you all very much.